You beheld my fragility. Marry me this moment, or darkness will hunt us." The Apache lass cried out. The summer of 1879 brought unforgiving heat to the Arizona Territory. The sun burned everything beneath it without mercy. Rivers dried into cracked beds of mud. Cattle dropped dead in the fields. And men who wandered too far from water never returned home. In this harsh land, a young man named Thomas Wilder worked his small ranch alone. He was 26 years old with sun-darkened skin and calloused hands that told stories of endless labor. His father had died 3 winters past from fever. His mother had followed 6 months later, her heart too broken to keep beating. Now, Thomas lived in the wooden house his father had built, tending 30 head of cattle and growing what vegetables the stubborn earth would allow. Thomas was not a man who spoke much. The isolation had taught him the value of silence. He talked to his horse, a painted mare named Dust, and sometimes to the wind when loneliness grew too heavy. But he never complained about his life. This land had been his father's dream, and Thomas would not abandon it. One evening, as the sun painted the desert in shades of orange and red, Thomas heard something unusual. It was a sound that did not belong to the wilderness, not a coyote's cry or an owl's call. It was the sound of a human voice, weak and desperate, carried on the hot breeze. Thomas grabbed his rifle and walked toward the sound. His boots crunched against the dry earth as he moved past the wooden fence that marked his property's edge. The voice grew clearer. It was a woman's voice, speaking words he could not understand. The language was Apache, though Thomas did not know this at the time. Behind a cluster of rocks near the dry creek bed, he found her. She was young, perhaps 20 years old, with long black hair that fell past her shoulders like a dark waterfall. Her skin was the color of desert clay, smooth and beautiful, even covered in dust and sweat. She wore a dress made of animal hide, decorated with beads that caught the dying sunlight. But what Thomas noticed first was the blood. A deep wound crossed her left side, staining her dress in dark crimson. Her hands pressed against the injury, trying to hold back what her body wanted to release. Her eyes, dark as midnight stones, looked up at Thomas with a mixture of fear and defiance. Even wounded and helpless, she did not beg. She simply stared at him, waiting to see what kind of man he was. Thomas had heard stories about Apache people from the men in town. They called them savages, killers, thieves who raided ranches and murdered innocent families. The territory was at war with several Apache bands, and hatred flowed freely on both sides. Many ranchers would have shot this woman where she lay and collected a bounty for her body. But Thomas was not like other ranchers. He saw only a wounded human being who would die without help. He lowered his rifle and knelt beside her. The woman tensed, her body preparing for violence that did not come. Thomas raised his hand slowly, showing he meant no harm. He pointed to her wound, then to his house in the distance, then made a gesture of helping. She understood. Her dark eyes studied his face for a long moment, searching for lies or tricks. She found none. Thomas helped her stand, supporting her weight against his shoulder. She was lighter than he expected, her body thin from what must have been days without food. Together they walked slowly toward his house, her blood leaving a trail in the dust behind them. Inside the small ranch house, Thomas laid her on his bed, the only real bed in the home. He lit candles and gathered what supplies he had: clean cloth, a bottle of whiskey, a needle and thread. He had treated wounded cattle before, but never a person. His hands trembled slightly as he prepared to work. The woman watched his every movement with alert eyes. When he approached with the whiskey bottle, she understood. She grabbed a piece of leather from her dress and placed it between her teeth. Then she nodded, giving him permission to begin. Thomas cleaned the wound as gently as possible. The cut was deep, but had missed anything vital. He stitched the torn flesh with careful precision, trying to cause as little pain as possible. The woman made no sound throughout the process. She bit down on the leather and endured, her body rigid with controlled agony. Sweat rolled down her face, but she did not cry out. When Thomas finished, he bandaged her side with clean cloth. He brought her water, which she drank desperately. Then he offered her dried meat and bread, food she accepted without hesitation. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. They simply existed in the same space, two strangers connected by circumstance. Finally, the woman spoke. Her English was broken but understandable, learned perhaps from traders or missionaries who had passed through her lands. She said her name was Kaya, which meant wise child in her language. She was from a small Apache band that lived in the mountains to the north. 3 days ago, her people had been attacked by American soldiers and civilian militias. Many had been killed. Others had been captured and sent to the reservation where Apache people were forced to live like prisoners. Kaya had escaped, running through the desert for 3 days with soldiers hunting her like an animal. The wound in her side came from a soldier's bayonet. She had fought back when they tried to capture her, and one of them had cut her during the struggle. She had been running and hiding ever since, with no food, little water, and a wound that grew more infected with each passing hour. She had accepted that death would find her soon. Then she had heard Thomas's horse nearby and called out, hoping for help but expecting a bullet. Thomas listened to her story without interruption. When she finished, he saw tears forming in her strong eyes, though she refused to let them fall. Her people were gone. Her family was either dead or imprisoned. She had nothing left except her life, and even that was uncertain. Thomas told her she could stay. She could rest and heal in his home until she was strong enough to decide her own path. He would not turn her over to the soldiers. He would not collect any bounty. He would simply help her because that was the decent thing to do. Kaya stared at him with something like wonder. In her experience, white men brought only destruction to her people. They took land that did not belong to them. They killed buffalo until the great herds disappeared. They broke every treaty they signed and called Apache people savages while committing savagery themselves. Yet here was a white man offering her shelter and kindness with nothing expected in return. She asked him why. Why would he risk his own safety to help an Apache woman? The soldiers would punish him severely if they discovered her here. His neighbors would shun him or worse. He had everything to lose and nothing to gain. Thomas thought about the question for a long moment. Then he answered honestly. He said he had lost everyone he loved in recent years. He knew what it meant to be alone in a world that did not care if you lived or died. He could not look at another human being suffering and simply walk away. That was not the man his mother had raised. That was not the man he wanted to be. Kaya accepted his answer. She had no choice but to trust him, at least for now. Her body was too weak to run, and her options had all disappeared. She would stay and heal and see what fate had planned for her next. The following days passed slowly. Thomas went about his ranch work as usual, tending cattle and maintaining his property. But now he also cared for Kaya, bringing her food and water, changing her bandages, and checking her wound for signs of infection. She healed faster than he expected, her body strong despite what it had endured. As her strength returned, Kaya began to move around the small house. She insisted on helping with simple tasks like cooking and cleaning. Thomas protested at first, telling her she needed rest. But Kaya was not a woman who accepted idleness. She needed to work, to feel useful, to repay the debt she believed she owed. Through their shared work, they began to know each other. Kaya's English improved as she practiced, and Thomas found himself talking more than he had in years. He told her about his parents, about his childhood on this ranch, about his dreams and disappointments. She listened with genuine interest, asking questions that showed she truly wanted to understand. Kaya shared her own stories in return. She spoke of her childhood in the mountains, running free among the pine trees with her brothers and sisters. She described the beauty of Apache ceremonies, the wisdom of her grandmother, the strength of her father, who had been a respected warrior. She told him how her mother made the most beautiful beadwork in the entire band, intricate patterns that told stories of their ancestors. These happy memories always led to darker ones. The soldiers came more frequently each year, pushing Apache people further into smaller territories. The buffalo disappeared, and with them, the Apache way of life. Starvation became common. Sickness spread through the camps. Treaties were signed and broken. Reservations were established, but they were little better than prisons where proud people were expected to forget everything they had been. Thomas listened to these stories with growing shame. He had never thought deeply about what his people had done to the native inhabitants of this land. He had accepted the stories told in town, the propaganda that painted Apache people as enemies who deserved their fate. Now, hearing Kaya's voice tremble as she described watching her brother die from a white man's disease, he understood that the truth was far more complicated and far more tragic. 2 weeks after her arrival, Kaya's wound had healed enough for her to move freely. The time had come for her to make a decision about her future. She could try to find any surviving members of her band, though this seemed unlikely. She could surrender to the reservation and accept a life of captivity, or she could try to disappear into Mexico, where some Apache groups had fled to escape American control. None of these options appealed to her. Finding her people would mean more running, more danger, more uncertainty. The reservation meant giving up her identity and living under rules that destroyed her spirit. Mexico was far away, and she would have to cross hundreds of miles of hostile territory alone. There was another option, one that had been growing in both their minds, though neither had spoken it aloud. She could stay here, with Thomas, building a new life from the ashes of her old one. Thomas had thought about this possibility constantly. He tried to tell himself it was foolish. The challenges they would face were enormous. His neighbors would never accept an Apache woman living among them. The soldiers might come looking for escaped prisoners and discover her. The danger to both of them was very real. But despite all these concerns, Thomas could not imagine his life without Kaya in it. Her presence had changed everything about his small world. The house felt warmer with her in it. The work felt lighter when they did it together. The silence that had once been his only companion now seemed empty and unwelcoming. He was falling in love with her, though he was too cautious to say the words. He watched her move through his home with natural grace. He listened to her voice and felt something deep inside him come alive for the first time. He lay awake at night, thinking about her sleeping in his bed while he took the floor, and he wished the world was different enough to allow them a future together. Kaya felt similar emotions stirring within her own heart. Thomas was unlike any man she had known. He was gentle in a world that rewarded hardness. He was kind in a world that celebrated cruelty. He saw her as a person, not as a representative of her people or an enemy to be destroyed. When he looked at her, she felt seen in a way that made her soul tremble. But Kaya was also practical. She understood the world they lived in with brutal clarity. A white man and an Apache woman together would face hatred from both sides. His people would call him a traitor and worse. Her people, if any survived, might view her with suspicion for living among the enemy. They would be isolated, two people against entire communities of opposition. Still, when she looked at Thomas, she saw something worth fighting for. After losing everything else, perhaps love was worth the risk. The confession came unexpectedly one evening. Thomas was chopping wood outside the house when Kaya approached him. The sunset bathed everything in golden light, and she looked impossibly beautiful standing there in the dress he had bought for her from a traveling merchant. The dress was simple blue cotton, but she wore it like a queen's robe. She told him she had decided to leave. She would head south toward Mexico and try to start over in a place where she might find peace. She thanked him for everything he had done. She said she would remember his kindness until her last breath. Thomas felt his heart collapse inside his chest. He wanted to beg her to stay, but the words stuck in his throat. How could he ask her to remain in a place where she would always be in danger? How could he be selfish enough to put his feelings above her safety? But Kaya was not finished speaking. She said that leaving was what she should do, the logical choice that any wise person would make. Then she said that logic had nothing to do with what her heart wanted. She looked directly into his eyes and asked him a simple question. She asked if he wanted her to stay. Thomas dropped the axe. He walked toward her until they stood close enough to touch. He could smell the sage she had used to wash her hair. He could see the hope and fear mixing in her dark eyes. He could feel his own heartbeat pounding against his ribs like a wild animal trying to escape. He told her yes. He told her he wanted her to stay more than he had ever wanted anything in his life. He told her that his home was not much, and his life was not exciting, but everything he had was hers if she would have it. He told her he loved her, though he had never said those words to anyone before. Kaya smiled, and it was like watching the sun rise over the desert after a long, cold night. She reached up and touched his face with gentle fingers. Then she told him she loved him too, though such feelings made no sense given everything that had happened between their peoples. They stood there in the golden sunset, two people who had found each other against impossible odds. For that moment, nothing else mattered. Not the soldiers who might come hunting, not the neighbors who would judge them, not the history of violence that separated their peoples. There was only this connection, this love that had grown from compassion and blossomed into something beautiful. But even as they embraced, darkness was gathering on the horizon. Forces were moving that would test their love in ways they could not imagine. And Kaya carried a secret that would soon change everything about their fragile happiness. The true storm was only beginning to form. The weeks that followed were the happiest Thomas had ever known. He and Kaya built a life together within the small ranch, learning each other's rhythms and creating new traditions that belonged only to them. She taught him how to track animals through the desert using signs he had never noticed before. He taught her how to plant vegetables in the stubborn Arizona soil. Together they worked from sunrise to sunset, and their labor felt light because they shared it. Kaya's presence transformed the lonely ranch house into a home. She hung dried herbs from the ceiling beams, filling the air with pleasant smells. She arranged stones and feathers on the windowsill, small, beautiful objects she found during her walks. She cooked meals that combined Apache traditions with the supplies Thomas brought from town, creating dishes that were entirely new and entirely wonderful. Thomas found himself smiling without reason, laughing at small things, feeling lighter than he had in years. He would catch Kaya watching him from across the room, and the warmth in her eyes made his chest tight with emotion. He never imagined such happiness was possible for someone like him. But happiness in the Arizona territory always carried shadows. Thomas knew they could not hide forever. Every trip to town for supplies felt dangerous. The men at the general store asked questions about his life that he answered carefully, never mentioning Kaya. The sheriff looked at him with suspicious eyes whenever they crossed paths. Word traveled fast in small communities, and secrets rarely stayed buried for long. The nearest town was called Copper Springs, a dusty settlement of perhaps 200 souls. It had grown around a copper mine that had since been abandoned, leaving behind a collection of desperate people with few options and fewer hopes. The men there worked cattle or hunted for gold that did not exist. The women raised children and prayed for better futures. Everyone knew everyone else's business, and strangers were viewed with immediate distrust. Thomas had never been popular in Copper Springs. His quiet nature and solitary lifestyle made people uncomfortable. They called him strange behind his back and sometimes to his face, but he had been tolerated because he caused no trouble and paid his debts. Now, with Kaya in his life, he had a secret that would turn tolerance into hatred if discovered. 1 month after their confession of love, Thomas made his regular trip to town for supplies. He loaded his wagon with flour, salt, coffee, and other necessities, nodding politely to the few people who acknowledged him. Everything seemed normal until he stepped out of the general store and found 3 men waiting for him. The leader was a man named Garrett Walsh, a rancher who owned the largest spread in the territory. Walsh was known for his hatred of Apache people. His brother had been killed in a raid 5 years earlier, and Walsh had spent considerable money funding military expeditions against Apache bands. He viewed all native people as enemies deserving extermination, and he made no secret of his beliefs. Walsh stood in the middle of the dusty street, with his arms crossed over his broad chest. He was a big man with a red face and small, cruel eyes that reflected no warmth. Behind him stood 2 hired hands, rough men who did whatever Walsh commanded without question or conscience. Walsh called out to Thomas in a voice loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. He said there were rumors going around about Thomas. Rumors that he was harboring something on his ranch that did not belong there. Rumors that made certain people very curious about what young Thomas Wilder was hiding from his neighbors. Thomas felt cold fear wash through his body, but he kept his face calm. He asked Walsh what kind of rumors he meant, pretending ignorance he did not feel. Walsh smiled, but there was no friendliness in the expression. He said some folks had seen Thomas buying extra supplies lately. More food than one man would need. More cloth and thread than a bachelor would require. Some folks were wondering if Thomas had company out there on his isolated ranch. Female company, perhaps. Thomas forced himself to laugh, though the sound felt hollow in his own ears. He said he had taken on a hired hand to help with the cattle. A quiet fellow who did not like coming to town. Nothing mysterious about it. Walsh studied Thomas with those small, cruel eyes, looking for lies. After a long moment, he seemed to accept the explanation, or at least pretend to accept it. He said that was good to hear. He said Thomas should bring this hired hand to town sometime so folks could meet him properly. He said it was not healthy for people to keep secrets from their neighbors in dangerous times like these. Thomas agreed and climbed onto his wagon as calmly as he could manage. He drove out of town at a normal pace, resisting the urge to whip his horses into a gallop. Only when Copper Springs disappeared behind the hills did he allow himself to breathe properly again. When Thomas returned home and told Kaya about the encounter, she listened with growing concern. She understood the danger better than he did. Men like Walsh would not stop asking questions. They would watch and wait and eventually discover the truth. And when that happened, the consequences would be terrible for both of them. Kaya said they needed to make a decision. They could not continue living in uncertainty, waiting for disaster to find them. Either they needed to leave this place entirely, running away to somewhere they might not be known, or they needed to find a way to legitimize her presence here that would satisfy the suspicious minds of Thomas's neighbors. Thomas thought about these options throughout the night. Leaving meant abandoning his father's ranch, the land his family had sacrificed everything to claim. It meant starting over somewhere unknown with no money, no connections, and no guarantees. The thought of giving up his home felt like cutting off a piece of his own heart. But staying meant continuing to hide, continuing to lie, continuing to look over their shoulders for enemies approaching. It meant putting Kaya in constant danger of discovery. It meant living in fear rather than freedom. Neither choice was good. Both carried tremendous risk. But as Thomas lay awake staring at the wooden ceiling his father had built, he realized something important. He would rather face any danger with Kaya than face safety without her. Whatever they decided, they would decide together. The next morning, Thomas and Kaya sat together on the small porch and talked about their future. The sun rose over the desert, painting the rocks and cacti in shades of pink and gold. Birds sang their morning songs without concern for the troubles of humans below. The world continued its ancient rhythms, indifferent to the crisis unfolding in one small ranch house. Kaya spoke first. She said there was something she had been thinking about for days, something that might solve their problem, but would require great courage from both of them. She asked Thomas to listen to her idea before responding. She said they should get married, properly married, with legal papers and official recognition. If Kaya was Thomas's wife, she would have some protection under white man's law. She could not be arrested simply for being Apache. She could not be sent to a reservation as a single woman might be. Marriage would give her a status that might shield them both from the worst consequences. Thomas felt his heart leap at the word marriage. He had dreamed of making Kaya his wife, but had not dared to speak the desire aloud. The obstacles seemed too enormous, the opposition too fierce. But hearing her suggest it herself changed everything. He asked if she was certain. Marriage to him would mean leaving her people's traditions behind. It would mean tying herself to a white man in a ceremony that her ancestors might not recognize. It would mean accepting a life that was neither fully Apache nor fully American, but something new and uncertain between the two worlds. Kaya smiled sadly. She said her old life was already gone. Her people were scattered, imprisoned, or dead. The traditions of her grandmother lived only in her memory now. She could spend her remaining years mourning what was lost, or she could build something new from the pieces that remained. She chose to build. Thomas took her hands in his. He looked into her dark eyes and saw strength that humbled him. This woman had survived horrors that would have broken most people. She had lost everything and still found the courage to love again. She was offering him not just her heart, but her trust in a world that had given her every reason to trust no one. He said yes. He said he would marry her today if she wished it. He said he would love her and protect her until his last breath. He said these words with tears running down his weathered face, tears he did not try to hide. But Kaya raised a warning hand. She said marriage alone might not be enough. Walsh and men like him would still view her as an enemy, wife or not. They needed more than legal papers. They needed allies, people in the community who would speak for them when trouble came. Without support, they would remain isolated and vulnerable. Thomas knew she was right, but finding allies seemed impossible. The people of Copper Springs had never welcomed him into their circle. They barely tolerated his presence among them. Why would they suddenly defend his Apache wife against powerful men like Walsh? Kaya suggested something that surprised Thomas deeply. She suggested they go to the church, not because she believed in the Christian God, but because the church held power in small communities. A minister who blessed their union would give them respectability. A congregation that accepted them would provide witnesses to their legitimate marriage. Faith communities looked after their own, and becoming part of that community might offer protection politics could not provide. Thomas had not been inside a church since his mother's funeral. He was not a religious man, and the thought of pretending faith made him uncomfortable. But he understood Kaya's logic. She was not asking him to believe anything. She was asking him to use the tools available to protect their family. He agreed to try. The next Sunday, Thomas put on his cleanest shirt and drove the wagon toward Copper Springs with Kaya beside him. She wore the blue cotton dress again, her hair braided neatly, her face calm despite the terror she must have felt. They were riding directly into the heart of enemy territory, exposing her existence to everyone who might wish her harm. The Church of Copper Springs was a small wooden building with a crooked steeple that leaned slightly eastward. It had been built by the town's founders 20 years earlier and had seen better days. The white paint was peeling, the steps were warped, and the bell had not rung properly in years. But on Sunday mornings, most of the town gathered inside to hear Reverend Mills preach about salvation and damnation. When Thomas's wagon appeared in front of the church, the congregation's chatter stopped immediately. Faces turned toward the unusual sight of solitary Thomas Wilder arriving for services. Then those faces registered the woman sitting beside him, and the silence grew thick as winter ice. Thomas helped Kaya down from the wagon with careful courtesy. He offered her his arm, and together they walked toward the church entrance. The crowd parted before them, not from respect, but from shock. Some people stared with open mouths. Others whispered urgently to their neighbors. A few moved away as if Kaya carried disease. Garrett Walsh stood near the church entrance with his wife and 2 sons. His face went red with anger when he saw Kaya. He stepped forward as if to block their path, his hands balling into fists at his sides. Thomas met Walsh's eyes without flinching. He said good morning in a clear voice that everyone could hear. He said he wanted to introduce his intended bride to the community. He said her name was Kaya, and he hoped his neighbors would welcome her as a future member of the congregation. Walsh laughed, but the sound was ugly and mean. He said Thomas had lost his mind. He said no decent church would allow a savage inside its doors. He said Thomas was betraying his own people by associating with vermin who murdered innocent Christians. Thomas felt anger rising in his chest, but he kept his voice steady. He said Kaya was not a savage. He said she was a woman who had survived terrible suffering and found her way to faith. He said anyone who called themselves Christian should remember that Jesus welcomed all people, not just those who looked the same or talked the same or came from the same tribes. The confrontation might have turned violent right there on the church steps. Walsh's hands were moving toward his belt, and his hired men were watching for signals. But before blood could be spilled, another voice rang out across the gathering. Reverend Mills appeared in the church doorway. He was an old man with white hair and kind eyes that had seen much suffering in his long life. He had been a chaplain during the Civil War, tending to wounded soldiers from both sides with equal compassion. He had built this church with his own hands and served this community for 15 years. When he spoke, people listened. The Reverend said all were welcome in God's house. He said the church doors were open to anyone seeking salvation, regardless of their history or heritage. He said if young Thomas wanted to introduce his bride to the congregation, then the congregation should receive her with the love Christ commanded. Walsh protested loudly. He said the Reverend was making a mistake. He said allowing an Apache woman into the church was an insult to everyone who had lost family to native raids. He said the community would not stand for such an outrage. Reverend Mills looked at Walsh with gentle but firm eyes. He asked Walsh if he remembered the parable of the Good Samaritan. He asked if Walsh remembered that Jesus dined with tax collectors and sinners, while the supposedly righteous people condemned him. He asked if Walsh wanted to place himself among the righteous who rejected Christ's teachings about compassion. Walsh had no answer to these questions. He stood sputtering with rage while the Reverend stepped aside and gestured for Thomas and Kaya to enter the church. That Sunday service changed everything. Thomas and Kaya sat in the back pew, surrounded by hostile stares and whispered insults. But they also received something unexpected. A few people, perhaps 6 or 7 in a congregation of 50, offered small nods of acknowledgement. One elderly woman actually smiled at Kaya. A young mother with a baby moved aside to make room for them without any sign of disgust. It was not acceptance. It was barely tolerance. But it was a beginning. After the service, Reverend Mills asked Thomas and Kaya to stay. He led them to his small office behind the altar and offered them tea. Then he asked them to tell their story honestly, holding nothing back. Thomas told the Reverend everything. He described finding Kaya wounded near his property. He explained how he had helped her heal and how love had grown between them. He admitted the dangers they faced and the reason they had come to church seeking allies. Reverend Mills listened without judgment. When Thomas finished, the old man sat quietly for a long moment. His fingers steepled beneath his chin. Then he spoke words that would echo in Thomas's memory for the rest of his life. The Reverend said, "Love was the highest calling God placed upon human hearts." He said fear and hatred were the tools of evil, used to divide people who should live in peace. He said Thomas and Kaya's love was not a sin but a blessing, a light shining in dark times. He said he would be honored to perform their wedding ceremony and would defend their union against anyone who objected. But the Reverend also offered a warning. He said Walsh would not accept defeat quietly. He said powerful men had many ways to destroy those who defied them. He said Thomas and Kaya must prepare for dark days ahead, days that would test their love to its breaking point. Thomas thanked the Reverend with tears in his eyes. Kaya, who had remained silent throughout the conversation, finally spoke. She told the Reverend she had seen much evil done in the name of faith. Soldiers who prayed before massacring her people. Missionaries who stole Apache children from their families. Churches that blessed the theft of native lands. But she also said she saw something different in Reverend Mills. She saw a man who actually lived the words he preached. She saw compassion that was real, not performed. She said if Christianity meant following men like Reverend Mills, then perhaps it was not the enemy she had believed. The Reverend bowed his head humbly. He said Christianity, like all faiths, was practiced by imperfect humans who often failed its teachings. He said the failures of Christians did not make Christ's message wrong. He said he could only try to be better, to love more, to judge less, and to treat every person as a child of God deserving of dignity. Thomas and Kaya left the church that day with something they had not possessed that morning. They had hope, real, tangible hope that perhaps they could build a life together in this unforgiving land. But as they drove home through the desert afternoon, neither of them noticed the rider following at a distance. Walsh had sent one of his men to track where Thomas lived to discover the exact location of his isolated ranch. The information would be needed for what Walsh was planning. The darkness Kaya had feared was gathering its forces, and it would strike sooner than anyone expected. The wedding was planned for the following Saturday. Reverend Mills agreed to perform the ceremony at Thomas's ranch rather than the church, knowing that Walsh might cause trouble in town. A small group of supporters would attend, including the elderly woman who had smiled at Kaya, the young mother with her baby, and 3 other families who believed in the Reverend's message of compassion. Thomas spent the days before the wedding preparing his property for guests. He cleaned the house until every surface shone. He built benches from spare wood for people to sit during the ceremony. He even found wildflowers growing near the dry creek bed and transplanted them to create a small garden near the front porch. Kaya watched his efforts with deep emotion. No man had ever worked so hard to please her. In Apache tradition, marriage ceremonies were simpler affairs, more focused on the union of 2 families than elaborate celebrations. But she understood that Thomas needed to do this. He needed to show the world that their love was worth celebrating, worth honoring, worth all the effort he could give. She had her own preparations to complete. Using cloth Thomas had bought in town, Kaya began sewing her wedding dress. She worked by candlelight after Thomas fell asleep, her fingers moving with practiced skill. The dress would be simple white cotton, but she decorated it with beadwork patterns from her Apache heritage. Blue beads for the sky, green for the earth, red for the blood of ancestors. The dress would honor both worlds she now inhabited. 3 nights before the wedding, Kaya woke Thomas from sleep with urgent whispers. Something was wrong. She had heard sounds outside the house, sounds that did not belong to the natural night. Footsteps and voices, barely audible, but definitely human. Thomas grabbed his rifle and moved to the window. The moon was bright enough to illuminate the yard, and what he saw made his blood freeze. At least a dozen men on horseback were surrounding the house. Torches flickered in some of their hands, painting their faces in demonic orange light. At the front of the group sat Garrett Walsh on his large black horse, a rifle balanced across his saddle. Walsh called out in the darkness. He said Thomas had 1 minute to send out the Apache woman. He said if Thomas cooperated, no harm would come to him. He said if Thomas resisted, they would burn the house to the ground with both of them inside. Thomas's mind raced through possibilities. He was 1 man against 12 or more. His rifle held 5 bullets, and he had another box of ammunition by the bed. Even if he shot perfectly, he could not kill them all before they overwhelmed him. Fighting would mean death for both him and Kaya. But surrender was impossible. Thomas knew what these men would do to Kaya. They would not arrest her or return her to a reservation. They would murder her as an example, a warning to others who might sympathize with Apache people. Her death would be slow and cruel, witnessed by men who considered themselves righteous. Kaya touched his shoulder. Her eyes were calm despite the terror of the moment. She said she had known this day would come. She said she had always known that happiness borrowed from a cruel world would eventually be reclaimed. She said she would walk out willingly if it meant saving his life. Thomas turned to her with fierce determination. He said she would not sacrifice herself. He said they would fight together or escape together, but he would not let her die for him. He said his life without her was no life at all. Kaya saw the truth in his eyes. She saw a man who meant every word, who would die beside her rather than live without her. In that moment, despite the darkness gathering outside, she felt something beautiful swell in her chest. This was love, real love, the kind of love that songs were written about and stories were told about, the kind of love that most people only dreamed of finding. She grabbed his face between her hands and spoke the words that had been building inside her for weeks. She said he had beheld her fragility, her wounds, her weakness, and he had not turned away. She said he had seen her as a person when others saw only an enemy. She said she wanted to be his wife before whatever came next. She begged him to marry her in that moment, right there in the darkness with enemies at the door. Thomas understood. If they were going to die tonight, they would die as husband and wife. Their union would be complete, witnessed only by themselves and whatever God watched over them. No official ceremony was needed when love this powerful demanded recognition. He took her hands in his. Looking into her eyes, he spoke vows from his heart. He promised to love her in this life and whatever came after. He promised to honor her courage and cherish her spirit. He promised that nothing, not death itself, would separate what they had built together. Kaya spoke her own vows. In a mixture of English and Apache, she promised her heart and soul to this man who had saved her life and given it new meaning. She promised to stand beside him against any darkness that hunted them. She promised to carry his memory in her heart until the stars themselves burned out. They sealed their vows with a kiss, brief but filled with everything they felt. Then they turned to face their enemies together, husband and wife at last. Walsh was growing impatient outside. He shouted that time was up. He ordered his men to set fire to the house. Torches were thrown toward the wooden walls, and flames began to lick at the dry timber. Thomas opened the front door and fired his rifle at the nearest attacker. The man fell from his horse with a scream. Chaos erupted in the yard as Walsh's men scrambled for cover. Thomas pulled Kaya toward the back of the house, hoping to escape through the rear window while attention focused on the front. But Walsh had anticipated this. 2 men waited behind the house, their guns already raised. Thomas fired again, hitting one of them, but the other shot back. The bullet struck Thomas in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to his knees. Kaya screamed his name. She grabbed the rifle from his weakened hands and fired at the remaining attacker, her aim true despite never having used this weapon before. The man fell and Kaya helped Thomas to his feet. Blood soaked through his shirt, but he could still move. They ran into the desert night, leaving the burning house behind them. The flames illuminated their escape, making them visible to Walsh and his remaining men. Horses thundered behind them as the attackers gave chase. Thomas knew they could not outrun horses on foot. His wound slowed him further with each step. The blood loss made his vision blur and his legs weaken. He told Kaya to leave him, to save herself while he held them off, but she refused absolutely. She said they lived together or died together. There was no other way. They reached the dry creek bed where Thomas had first found Kaya wounded. The banks provided some cover, and Thomas pressed himself against the rocky wall with Kaya beside him. He had 3 bullets left, 3 chances to delay the inevitable. Walsh's men approached cautiously now. They knew their prey was cornered. They took their time, savoring the hunt's conclusion. Walsh himself dismounted and walked toward the creek bed with a torch in one hand and a pistol in the other. He called out mockingly. He said Thomas had made his choice and would pay the price. He said the Apache woman would suffer before she died, payment for his brother's death and all the other white men killed by her savage people. He said Thomas should prepare to watch. Thomas raised his rifle with trembling arms. His shoulders screamed with agony, but he forced himself to aim. He would take Walsh with him if nothing else. The man who had caused this evil would not survive to celebrate it. Just as Thomas prepared to fire, a new sound split the night air. Gunshots, but not from Walsh's direction, coming from somewhere beyond the creek, from the darkness of the open desert. One of Walsh's men fell, then another. Confusion spread through the attackers as they tried to identify this new threat. Out of the night came riders, perhaps 8 or 10 of them. Thomas recognized Reverend Mills in the lead, his white hair streaming behind him as he charged. Beside him rode the young mother's husband, a blacksmith with arms like tree trunks. Behind them came other members of the small group who had promised to attend the wedding. They had seen the flames from town. They had gathered what weapons they had and ridden out to help. It was a desperate, foolish act that should have gotten them all killed. But courage sometimes trumps calculation, and these ordinary people had found extraordinary bravery when their friends needed it most. The battle was brief, but vicious. Walsh's men were caught between Thomas's position and the charging rescuers. Some fled immediately, unwilling to die for Walsh's vendetta. Others fought and fell. Walsh himself stood frozen with shock as his force crumbled around him. Reverend Mills rode directly at Walsh, his aged body moving with surprising strength. He knocked Walsh to the ground and held him there at gunpoint. His voice rang out with authority that seemed to come from somewhere beyond himself. The Reverend declared that Walsh's crimes would be reported to the territorial authorities: murder, arson, attempted lynching. These were hanging offenses, and Walsh would face justice for them. The Reverend said any man who fled tonight would be hunted down and prosecuted. He said this violence ended here and now. Walsh sputtered with rage, but he saw his situation clearly. His men were dead or scattered. His victims had survived. His crimes had witnesses who would testify against him. The power he had wielded so confidently had evaporated in a single night. Thomas crawled out of the creek bed with Kaya supporting him. His wound was serious but not fatal if treated quickly. He looked at the Reverend and the others who had risked their lives to save him. He could not find words for what he felt. Reverend Mills smiled gently. He said the wedding guests had arrived a few days early. He said they did not want to miss the celebration. Despite the pain and exhaustion and lingering fear, Thomas laughed. The sound startled him, but he could not stop it. The absurdity of the moment, the incredible fact that they had survived, the love of strangers who became friends through shared courage. All of it overwhelmed him, and laughter was the only response he could manage. The following weeks brought many changes to the community of Copper Springs. Walsh was arrested by territorial marshals and eventually tried for his crimes. His testimony implicated others who had participated in the attack. The trial became news throughout the territory, and public opinion shifted against those who advocated violence against native peoples. Thomas recovered from his wound slowly. The bullet had missed anything vital, but the healing took time and careful attention. Kaya nursed him constantly, using traditional Apache remedies alongside the medicine the town doctor provided. The combination worked better than either approach alone. They rebuilt the ranch house with help from their new friends. The structure that rose from the ashes was larger and stronger than before. Multiple families contributed labor, and the work went quickly. By autumn, Thomas and Kaya had a home again, surrounded by people who cared about their welfare. The wedding finally happened on a cool October morning. Reverend Mills performed the ceremony in front of the new house, with witnesses filling the yard. Kaya wore the dress she had sewn by candlelight, the beadwork catching the sun as she walked toward her husband. Thomas wore the suit his father had been married in, carefully preserved all these years. The vows they spoke that day were simpler than the desperate promises exchanged during the attack, but they carried equal weight. This was a public declaration of what they had proven in private. Their love was strong enough to survive fire and hatred. It was strong enough to build new worlds from old ashes. After the ceremony, there was food and music and dancing. People who had never socialized before found common ground in celebration. Apache songs mixed with American hymns. Traditional native dishes sat alongside frontier cooking. For one afternoon, the boundaries between peoples dissolved into simple human joy. Kaya found herself surrounded by women who wanted to learn about her beadwork, her cooking, her healing knowledge. They asked questions with genuine curiosity rather than judgment. She taught them what she could and learned from them in return. The cultural exchange flowed both directions, enriching everyone involved. Thomas watched his wife from across the celebration. He could not believe how far they had come from that first night when he found her bleeding by the creek. He could not believe that this woman, this magnificent woman, had chosen to build a life with him. He could not believe that happiness this complete was possible in a world so often defined by pain. The years that followed tested them in many ways. The Arizona Territory remained hostile to Apache people despite the changes their community experienced. There were hard winters when cattle died and crops failed. There were illnesses that frightened them and losses that grieved them. Life never became easy, and they never expected it to. But they faced every challenge together. They built their herd and expanded their land. They welcomed children into their family. 3 daughters and 1 son, who grew up knowing both heritages. They became respected members of their community, known for their generosity and wisdom. Kaya never forgot her Apache roots, and she made sure her children knew them too. She taught them the language of their ancestors, the stories, the ceremonies, the ways of seeing the world that had sustained her people for countless generations. She also taught them to navigate the American world with skill and confidence. Her children would belong to both worlds, bridges between peoples who had too often been enemies. Thomas became an advocate for Apache rights in the territory. He testified before government officials about the injustices he had witnessed. He supported families who faced persecution for their heritage. He used his position as a respected white rancher to open doors that would have remained closed to native voices alone. Their love story spread throughout the region, becoming something of a legend. Young people heard about the rancher who saved an Apache woman and married her despite all obstacles. They heard about the community that defended them against hatred. They heard about love that conquered fear. Some dismissed the story as exaggeration or romantic nonsense, but those who met Thomas and Kaya knew the truth. Their love was as real as the desert sun. It had been forged in fire and tempered by hardship. It stood as proof that human beings could choose compassion over cruelty, connection over isolation, love over hate. Kaya lived to be 87 years old. She died peacefully in the house that had been rebuilt from ashes, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Thomas had passed 2 years earlier, unable to survive long without her presence. They were buried side by side on the ranch they had built together, facing the eastern mountains where Kaya's people had once lived free. Their descendants continued their legacy. The ranch remained in the family for generations. The community they helped create maintained its tradition of welcoming all people regardless of background. The story of their love was told and retold, inspiring new couples who faced obstacles of their own. And sometimes, when the desert wind blew through the canyon at sunset, old-timers claimed they could hear voices on the breeze. A man and woman speaking softly to each other, sharing secrets that belonged only to them. Whether this was truth or imagination, no one could say, but it felt true. It felt like something Thomas and Kaya would do, because love like theirs does not simply end. It echoes through time, touching hearts it will never know, changing lives it will never meet. It becomes part of the fabric of the world, woven into the land and sky and stars. And somewhere, in whatever realm awaits beyond this one, Thomas and Kaya continue their journey together, still learning from each other, still growing together, still proving that love is stronger than any darkness that hunts us. The story never really ends. It just keeps becoming something new.